6 seasoned outdoors people and professionals, scientists, runners, officers, and survivalists, faced a moment when nature's silence cracked open into chaos. From frozen camps to misty trails, these bear attack accounts reveal how quickly experience can crumble when raw instinct takes over. This happens when the wild doesn't give warnings and doesn't care who you are. In this video, we'll dive into 6 gripping real-life stories of bear attacks, each a chilling reminder of nature's unpredictability and power. The Shantar Islands were cold, windswept, and unreachable for half the year. Summer brought short days of gray skies, biting insects, and just enough warmth to thaw the edges of the sea. On June 1, 2025, 3 workers, Mira, Pavel, and Lena, huddled in the dim shelter on Bolshoi Shantar Island, where they ran a seasonal animal rehabilitation outpost. Mira, 33, was a former vet nurse with a gentle voice and worn hands. Pavel, 44, had worked on Arctic expeditions and moved with the calmness of someone used to danger. Lena, just 26, was the newest, still learning how quickly things could turn in the wild. Their shelter stood near the tree line, tucked away from the wind but close enough to the beach for supply drops. They cared for 13 sled dogs, abandoned after a failed racing season, and several rescued seabirds. The dogs were caged near the back, and the birds were in crates inside the main cabin. They'd gotten too comfortable, lulled into routine, believing that the island's harsh beauty came with a degree of safety. But that night, someone had forgotten to secure the latch on the food storage shed. It was enough. Around midnight, the wind shifted, and the dogs grew restless, their whines rising into anxious barks. Something massive moved through the trees, slow and heavy, drawn by the smell of meat and kibble. The Russian Grizzly lumbered from the woods, likely old and starving after a failed spring hunt. Over 7 feet tall and gaunt from winter, it had deep scars across its muzzle and shoulders. Its coat was patchy, its breath steaming in the cold air as it shoved its weight against the thin wooden wall of the storage shed. The door cracked, hinges popped. The bear burst inside. The crashing wood snapped the night apart. Mira sat up in her bunk in the main cabin, disoriented. Lena, sleeping in the adjacent room, froze under her blanket. Pavel had been checking traps in the dusk and returned just minutes earlier, still dressed. He first grabbed his headlamp and moved toward the dog's enclosure to investigate the noise. The dogs were going wild now, howling and snapping in panic. Having devoured a few bags of feed in the shed, the bear moved toward the scent of live meat. It smashed through the back fence in a roar of splinters. Dogs scattered, their cages offering no protection. The grizzly crushed one dog in its jaws and slammed another into the ground with a swipe that shattered bone. Pavel reached the enclosure seconds too late. He shouted, then waved his arms, trying to distract the bear. The beam of his headlamp caught its eyes, and the animal turned with terrifying speed. The bear charged, closing the distance in seconds. It hit Pavel like a boulder, knocking him flat and biting down on his shoulder, dragging him through the snow and muck. He didn't have time to scream. Inside the cabin, Mira bolted upright, realized what was happening, and scrambled to grab the emergency satellite radio. She shoved it into her coat, yelling for Lena, but Lena had already fled into the crawl space attic, the only lockable space in the building. Mira followed, pulling the ladder behind her as the bear's roar echoed outside. Below them, the bear crashed through the shelter wall, drawn by the scent of birds and humans. It tossed over crates, sending feathers and blood into the air. It knocked shelves aside and mauled 2 more dogs that had sought shelter inside. Pressed against the wooden beams, Mira could hear the animal's breath below. She whispered into the radio, sending fragments of her location to the mainland, her voice shaking as she tried to remain unheard. But then Lena, unable to keep still in the cramped attic and driven by panic, shifted too far toward the edge. A sudden groan of wood beneath her weight gave way with a crack. She tumbled through a weak spot in the boards and crashed onto the floor below. The bear was on her in seconds. Mira clamped her hands over her mouth as Lena's final screams were cut short in the chaos. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the bear's movements and the occasional dying cry of an animal below. The attic floor was thin, the wood groaning under even Mira's still weight. She kept whispering into the radio until the battery died just before dawn. Outside, the wind picked up. The bear, tired and blood-stained, moved in and out of the building, pacing the ruins, pushing at the walls as if expecting more resistance. The dogs were dead or gone. The seabirds had stopped screeching. The shelter stank of blood, fur, and splintered wood. Somewhere around 6 in the morning, the bear wandered into the trees to rest, belly swollen with stolen meat. The silence stretched until late morning. Then, the distant whir of helicopter blades broke across the treetops. Rangers had picked up Mira's message and flown out, landing near the edge of the compound, rifles raised as they stepped into the carnage. The shelter looked like a war zone. Blood smeared every surface. The rear fence had collapsed. Pavel's body lay outside, torn open near the dogs' pens. They found Lena's remains inside the house, mauled almost beyond recognition. But somehow, Mira had survived. When the Rangers opened the attic door, she didn't move at first, just blinked at them in silence. She was alone now, the only one left. It took another hour to find the bear, resting in a shallow dip near the ridge, covered in gore, unafraid even as the men raised their rifles. It didn't run when they shot. It simply slumped and exhaled. Back at the compound, only 5 dogs remained alive, scattered in the woods or hiding under overturned crates. Most of the seabirds were dead, feathers and blood coating the floor. The shelter would never reopen. The tragedy was blamed on food stress and human error. A missing latch, a hungry predator, an isolated outpost too far for quick rescue. The authorities issued a brief statement, but those who saw the aftermath said there was no mistaking the bear's fury. It hadn't just killed to eat. It had destroyed everything in its path, whether from hunger, madness, or instinct. It had torn apart a place built to heal. And in the ruins of that hope, only one survivor remained to carry the memory of that long, frozen night. Landon Reese was 53, wiry and sun-worn, with over 2 decades of wilderness experience behind him. He'd spent most of his adult life guiding rafting tours, mapping unnamed creeks, and camping solo in the remote folds of British Columbia. That week, he'd been following an unmarked tributary of the Stikine River, kayaking deep into Grizzly country. It wasn't recklessness that brought him out here. It was comfort. Solitude was his element, the river his refuge. On the 3rd evening of his trip, Landon set camp on a gravel bank near a tight bend in the river. He stashed his food in a bear canister and put it far from camp, just like he always did. His bright orange kayak was pulled onto the shore and propped on a driftwood log. As the sun dropped behind the evergreens, he boiled water for dehydrated stew and checked over his gear. Everything seemed calm. He didn't see the bear until it moved toward his boat. The grizzly stepped silently from the trees. A big male, tall at the shoulder and heavy-set, its coat dusted with river silt and pine needles. It didn't growl or stomp. It stared at the kayak with a focused hunger, then walked straight toward it. Landon stood quickly, heart racing, and began shouting. Sharp, confident, deliberate noise. Most bears would turn at that. This one didn't. Instead, it walked up to the kayak and began sniffing the seams. Landon watched in disbelief as the bear opened its jaws and bit straight through the outer shell of the vessel. The plastic gave way with a sharp crack. Then the grizzly clawed at the front hatch, tearing deeper, ripping through gear still holding traces of old food smells, long-forgotten trail mix maybe, or grease that had settled into the padding. The scent was enough. Landon grabbed his bear spray from the side pouch of his tent and began moving forward. He knew the risk, but he couldn't afford to lose the kayak. It was his only way out. He held the canister at the ready, stepped closer, and prepared to spray the bear directly in the face. But the bear turned before he fired. It moved faster than his reflexes. Instantly, it lunged from the smashed kayak and closed the distance. Its paw slammed into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him sprawling back toward the river. He hit the water's edge hard, shoulder twisting at an unnatural angle as he rolled. The bear followed, growling low, and bit down on his upper shoulder, its teeth driving through his jacket and deep into flesh. Landon screamed. His body thrashed. In a blind panic, he gripped the bear spray and triggered it underwater. The spray fanned out uselessly beneath the surface, absorbed into the current, but some of the mist curled into the air just enough to sting the bear's face. It reared back, coughing and shaking its head, foam and river water mixing in the spray. That hesitation saved him. Landon crawled up from the river, one arm limp at his side, soaked and shivering, blood streaming down his back. The bear lingered, pacing, then snorted and disappeared into the trees, leaving the wrecked kayak in pieces on the gravel. The pain in his arm told him it was dislocated. His shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, muscles seizing. He sat there for minutes, dazed, dripping, his breath ragged in the twilight air. The nearest ranger station was more than 20 kilometers downstream. Without a kayak, he had nothing but the river. He knew he wouldn't survive the night if he stayed. Shaking, he gathered what remained of his gear. Dry bags floated at the edge of the shore. One had duct tape and a small patch kit inside. He worked with one functioning arm and his teeth, strapping the dry bags together and taping them to a broken section of the kayak frame. The float barely held shape, but it would carry him. He stuffed the rest of his supplies inside, wrapped himself in the remains of his bivy sack, and pushed off from the shore. The river was cold, the current strong. He drifted mostly, using his legs and one good hand to steer around boulders and deadfall. The stars came out above him, harsh and indifferent. Pain coursed through every part of his body. His shoulder burned with every shiver. Blood still leaked from the puncture wounds on his back. At some point before dawn, he started to hallucinate, thinking he saw lights in the trees or people on the bank. He knew none of it was real. Morning came slowly, the sky brightening over the pines. The river narrowed in places, pushing him faster. He held on. Hours passed. His body was numb, and he began to drift in and out of consciousness. When the ranger station finally appeared, a simple wood cabin with a flagpole and a battered canoe, he almost didn't believe it. He dragged himself onto the shore, stumbling up the rocky slope. The ranger inside heard the thud of a body hitting the porch and opened the door to find Landon half collapsed, his face pale, jacket soaked in blood. He was rushed by helicopter to the nearest hospital later that day. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. The bear bite had narrowly missed major arteries. His shoulder was dislocated and fractured. He had early-stage hypothermia and dozens of cuts and bruises, but he lived. Landon didn't return to the river that season. His kayak was later recovered, its body riddled with punctures and claw marks. The bear was never found. Authorities inspected the site and noted that the food had been stored properly, but they concluded the bear was likely conditioned to human scent and food residue on gear. A single smear of peanut oil left months earlier might have triggered the attack. Word spread among the backcountry community. People who had once viewed Landon as invincible were shaken. He'd done everything right, secured food, kept distance, carried spray, but it hadn't been enough. The river took his blood that night, but it also carried him out. As his wounds healed, the memory of the bear's silent way of studying his kayak like prey remained burned into his mind. It was a brutal reminder that in the wild, even experience didn't guarantee safety, and sometimes the quietest moments hid the deadliest threats. Trevor Holt had spent nearly 2 decades working as a wildlife officer in Alaska. At 42, he was experienced, respected, and known for keeping a steady hand during high-risk encounters. That June morning, the air was calm, and the forest around them was silent, except for the occasional rustle through spruce. Trevor and his partner, Miles Darnell, were deep in the hills of Kodiak Island, tracking a large female bear for a GPS collar study to improve conservation patterns. They had located the sow near a berry thicket at dawn. She was massive, likely over 700 pounds, heavy with spring forage and muscle from long winter fasting. They waited for the perfect angle from a ridge above, then fired the dart into her shoulder with practiced precision. Within minutes, she staggered and collapsed in a patch of low brush, breathing heavily, but unmoving. The standard protocol gave them 10 minutes before the approach. They waited 12, watching through binoculars as the sow's chest rose and fell more slowly. Confident in the sedation, they descended through the undergrowth, equipment ready. Trevor knelt by the bear's head while Miles moved toward the hindquarters with the collar and tools. The first signs of trouble came almost unnoticed. The bear's ear twitched, then her back leg shivered once, lightly. Trevor noticed but assumed it was a postural reflex, common enough even under full sedation. He reached forward and began securing the strap around her thick neck, guiding it past the fur matted with old mud and tangled grass. Then the bear's eyes opened. There was no delay, no warning growl or drawn-out stir. She exploded from the forest floor in one powerful motion, jaws wide, eyes wild with panic. The sedative had not finished its job. She was disoriented, partially numb, but awake enough to react with instinct and fear. Trevor didn't even have time to move before she lunged forward and slammed him backward into the base of a spruce tree. His breath was knocked out as his back struck the trunk, the force of her weight driving bark into his spine. She pinned him there with both front paws, her claws pressing deep through his jacket. He tried to scream, but the air had fled his lungs. Pain surged down his ribs, his thigh, his arm. Her claws raked down his side, catching muscle and slicing through fabric. Miles froze for a second in pure shock. Then instinct kicked in. He reached for the flare gun holstered at his belt, snapped the safety, and fired upward. The red flare hissed over the canopy with a high-pitched whistle, bursting in a flash of light just above the treetops. The sow flinched, her head whipping sideways. She roared, a low, confused bellow that shook the brush, and staggered off, Trevor, swiping the ground as she turned in a dazed circle. Her movements were jerky and sluggish now, the tranquilizer fighting to regain its grip as her blood pumped harder from adrenaline. She stumbled into a thicket and disappeared, crashing through branches like a ghost fleeing fire. Trevor slumped to the ground, blood soaking through his uniform. His back was torn open along one shoulder blade. His thigh pulsed with warmth, wet and sticky with deep wounds that ran jagged along the muscle. He blinked slowly, struggling to stay conscious. Miles was already at his side, calling for medevac on the satellite radio with shaking hands. The chopper arrived 40 minutes later. By then, Miles had packed gauze into the worst wounds and done what he could with a field tourniquet and pressure wrap. Trevor drifted in and out of awareness, whispering fragmented thoughts, his face pale. The crew lifted him into the cabin and took off into the sky, rotor blades thundering as they rose over the forest. At the hospital in Anchorage, surgeons worked for hours. The bear's claws had punctured deep near the spine, narrowly missing vital organs. One gash across the thigh required reconstructive surgery. The infections that followed made recovery even harder. He spent a month in the trauma unit, slipping between pain and medication. Each night, he'd dream of the bear's breath on his face and the flash of her eyes in the green light of morning. The department launched a full review of the tagging operation. They confirmed the sedative dosage was appropriate for the bear's estimated weight, but not for her size. She was far heavier than predicted, and her metabolism burned through the drug too quickly. It was a sobering failure that sent ripples through wildlife offices across Alaska. Protocols were rewritten, tagging approaches were delayed longer, equipment was updated, but none of that erased the moment the bear opened her eyes. Despite the injuries and the trauma, Trevor never blamed the animal. He said later, during a debrief, that the bear had been as scared as he was. She had woken up confused, unable to move right, unable to understand what was happening, and had lashed out in the only way she knew. That understanding didn't dull the pain, but it helped him heal. By late fall, he was walking again, limping slightly but determined. He nodded without hesitation when asked if he'd return to bear duty. It wasn't bravado or stubbornness, it was respect. He had spent his life studying wild animals and knew they weren't villains. That bear hadn't wanted to hurt him. It had simply acted as any wild creature would when fear collided with instinct in a moment of chaos. The tree where he was pinned still bore the marks, bark stripped, a gouge at chest height where the bear had pushed. Miles returned to the site once that summer, alone, and stood there for a long time. He found one claw mark in the dirt near a dropped tool and picked it up like a relic. The sow was seen later that season via a different camera trap. She'd survived, uncollared, her path unknown. Some thought she should have been tracked down, possibly removed, but Trevor disagreed. He believed she'd earned her space, just like he'd earned his scars. In the wild, no script holds. Timing shifts, doses fail, instincts clash. The bear didn't know the science. She only knew fear, and in that moment, so did he. Officer Daniel Reyes had spent 15 years serving rural communities across western Montana. At 39, he was known among the department as calm, sharp, and always the one to volunteer for the roughest assignments. That June morning, his unit had been sent deep into the Swan Range after a hiker was reported missing 2 days prior. A storm had passed the night before, soaking the forest and erasing any obvious trail. It was rugged country, dense, steep, and home to bears. The search team comprised 6 officers, 2 local volunteers, and a pair of dogs. Reyes led them single file up a narrow game trail, carved through thick spruce and tangled willows. The dogs pulled at their leads, noses twitching. The team pushed forward slowly, scanning ravines and checking gullies for signs of movement or discarded gear. The morning air was heavy with pine, and the only sound was boots in wet dirt and the quiet calls of ravens overhead. After an hour, Reyes paused at a bend where the ground opened to a small clearing. Scattered along the trail were bones, fresh elk remains, blood still slick on the ribcage. Some had been torn clean, others gnawed. Reyes crouched and studied them briefly, noting drag marks that led into the brush. He thought the kill looked recent, maybe within the past day. He stood, turned, and gestured for caution. But before the warning left his lips, the willows exploded before them. The grizzly came fast. No growl, no sound, just an eruption of muscle and brown fur from the undergrowth. The bear had likely been bedding down near the carcass, and now in a split second, it reacted as if defending a meal from thieves. The distance between them vanished in a heartbeat. Reyes was at the front, exposed and closest. The bear hit him hard, one paw across the shoulder, knocking him off his feet and onto his back. Before anyone could move, the grizzly lunged again, jaws closing over Reyes' upper chest. Bones cracked audibly. Its head shook violently. Blood sprayed into the ferns. Officers behind scrambled to raise their rifles, some fumbling with safeties, others paralyzed by shock. The bear let out a short huff. Jaws clamped around Reyes' neck, then grabbed his limp body by the vest and dragged him backward, disappearing into the brush with a terrifying, brutal efficiency. The team broke their silence. A rifle fired, a warning shot into the air. Another followed, echoing through the canyon walls. The bear reappeared for a split second in the brush, eyes wide and mouth red, then vanished again, crashing deeper into cover. Reyes' body was left slumped 10 feet from the trail, half covered in broken branches. Medics rushed in immediately, dropping beside him. His chest was torn open. The wounds were too deep, the bleeding too fast. He had been alive for only a minute or two after the initial attack, long enough to choke on blood and fade before help could reach him. One of the officers dropped to his knees nearby, hands pressed to his helmet, shoulders shaking. Another stood staring, rifle held useless at his side. The medics tried compressions and clamping wounds, but it was already over. They called it in. "Officer down, fatal bear attack." The radio hissed as the signal echoed through repeaters back to base. The forest was silent again, but the air hung thick with iron and grief. The team secured the area for the next hour, posted guards along the perimeter, and waited quietly. Wildlife agents arrived with tranquilizers and bear dogs. They tracked the grizzly for most of the afternoon, but halted pursuit after signs suggested it had fled the area entirely. They analyzed the scene and determined the bear's behavior wasn't predatory. It had been startled, its food threatened, and it reacted on instinct. That didn't make the result easier to bear. Reyes' body was flown out by helicopter that evening. Officers stood in a line, silent as the stretcher passed. Some removed their hats. One of the volunteers who'd joined the search had gone pale and refused to speak for hours after. The investigation concluded 2 weeks later. Wildlife officials confirmed the grizzly was a mature adult male, most likely food-stressed from a harsh spring. It had not sought out the officers, only responded to a perceived threat near its kill. They chose not to hunt it down because it retreated and had no record of previous aggression. It had acted like any wild bear would when startled while feeding. Daniel Reyes' funeral drew officers from across 3 states. The town of Kalispell lowered flags to half-mast, and dozens of locals lined the streets in silent tribute as the procession passed. His wife stood beside the chief, holding the folded flag, eyes fixed forward. At the trailhead where the team had entered that morning, a memorial was later installed, simple, carved in stone, bearing his name and badge number. The attack haunted the surviving officers. Some sought counseling. Others returned to the field quickly, needing to face the wild again before fear settled in too deep. They all remembered how fast it happened, how sudden, how helpless they'd felt when the forest turned against them in those few seconds. It remained one of the rare, fatal attacks on law enforcement by a wild animal in U.S. history. Not because the team lacked training or awareness, but because nature offers no guarantees, and wild predators don't weigh consequences. They react. Even seasoned teams, armed and prepared, aren't immune when walking into a feeding site, blind to what waits beneath the brush. In the months that followed, new protocols were established. Search teams now avoided game trails showing fresh kill. Officers were retrained in fast react drills and given better non-lethal deterrence. But no one forgot the silence that followed Reyes' final breath, or the thud of the bear as it vanished back into the trees. His last act had been to lead, to take point up a trail that seemed ordinary until it wasn't. He never had the chance to raise his weapon, never had time to shout. In that wild corner of Montana, the line between safety and death proved as thin as a branch in the wind, and just as easy to snap. Derek Fallon was 33, a lifelong athlete and ultramarathoner, who found solace in early morning trail runs through the mist-laced forests of western North Carolina. He lived near Brevard and worked remotely as a graphic designer, often beginning his days with long jogs along Forest Service roads and hidden footpaths winding through a national forest in the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina. That May morning, the sky was still dark as he tied his shoes, slipped on his hydration pack, and set off just before 5 a.m., earbuds in and music low. The air was cool and heavy with fog, which clung to the mossy ground and blurred the outlines of tree trunks. Derek knew these trails well. He ran them daily, using the climbs to push his limits and the downhills to feel weightless. He had no idea that less than 100 yards up the path, a black bear sow and her 2 cubs had bedded down for the night in a shallow hollow beside a thicket of mountain laurel. The bear had likely caught Derek's scent early, but with the shifting breeze and the softness of his footfalls, she didn't flee. Instead, she stayed alert, uneasy. The cubs moved nearby, playing among logs and roots. Derek, oblivious, jogged uphill toward them, each step closing the distance under the blanket of morning haze. He passed within 20 feet of the thicket at the bend in the trail. The bear charged without warning. The first thing Derek registered was a deep rustling to his right, louder than a deer. He turned and saw a blur of dark fur exploding from the brush. Before he could stop, the bear barreled into him. The impact lifted him off the trail and drove him into the wet ground. His earbuds ripped free. Pain exploded in his thigh as teeth sank deep, puncturing through muscle. Then came a slashing blow across his back, claws raking down through his shirt, tearing skin and flesh. He screamed, flailing beneath the bear's weight, kicking as he rolled. His leg burned. His back felt on fire. The bear loomed above him, jaws dripping with blood and breath hot against his cheek. But behind them, the cubs squealed and shifted, drawing the sow's attention. She hesitated. Then she backed off. It wasn't mercy. It was instinct. Hearing her cubs move in panic, the sow turned from the struggling runner and vanished into the brush with a low huff, leaving a trail of crushed ferns and branches. Derek was alone again, bleeding, face pressed into damp soil. For seconds, he didn't move. His leg throbbed with a deep, nauseating ache. His back burned with each breath. He rolled onto his side and fumbled for his smartwatch with shaking fingers. Blood smeared the screen as he pressed the emergency beacon, triggering a distress signal linked to his phone and a location marker. Then he lay still, heart hammering, eyes locked on the forest around him. It took nearly an hour for rescuers to arrive. Rangers, guided by GPS, found him barely conscious, curled beside the trail in a pool of blood and mud. His running shorts were shredded, soaked red, and his hydration pack was torn. They stabilized him quickly, applied pressure to his thigh, and wrapped his torso in gauze. The evacuation was fast but rough. Miles of uneven trail had to be covered with a stretcher before a helicopter could reach a clearing nearby. At the hospital, surgeons worked for hours. The bite had torn through muscle and nicked an artery in his leg. His back had multiple deep lacerations that required stitches and left him at risk of infection. Doctors were optimistic, but recovery would be slow. The story spread quickly. It shocked the local fitness community. Trail runners, cyclists, and hikers who had long considered the forests peaceful at dawn. But wildlife officers quickly clarified. The bear hadn't hunted him. It had reacted to a perceived threat, triggered by surprise and proximity in poor light. The sow likely thought he was a predator moving in fast on her cubs. Derek later recalled that he had never seen the bear until it was on him. There had been no time to think, no time to react. One moment he was running, the next he was fighting to stay conscious, trying to breathe through pain and confusion while blood soaked the earth. The Forest Service responded by issuing no-run advisories during spring cub season in high-traffic bear areas. Warning signs were posted at popular trailheads, and volunteer groups handed out flyers urging people to avoid dawn and dusk runs, especially alone. Rangers reminded the public that while black bears were less aggressive than grizzlies, they were still wild animals, and sows with cubs could be terrifyingly fast and dangerously unpredictable when startled. Derek spent weeks in recovery. The wounds healed, but he was left with long scars down his back and a deep, permanent groove along his thigh. He lost some mobility in that leg and dealt with phantom pain for months. He'd once dreamed of qualifying for the Leadville 100 ultramarathon, but that goal now seemed distant. Still, He didn't abandon the forest entirely. After therapy and rehab, he began walking the same trails again, slowly, during daylight, and with more awareness than ever before. The silence of the woods no longer comforted him in the same way. It now carried memory, but he still respected the wild, understood that what had happened wasn't malevolence. It was instinct colliding with motion. He kept the smartwatch that saved his life, its cracked screen now a reminder more powerful than any scar. And on the days he did return to the trails, he went without earbuds. He listened. The trees creaked, birds called, leaves moved in the wind, and always, somewhere deeper in the green, silence waited. Lars Nielsen had spent years chasing patterns in the polar cold, ice thickness, wind drift, seasonal melt, all part of his work with the Danish Arctic Research Program. At 44, he was seasoned, cautious, and deeply respectful of the landscape. His team had set up camp on a remote ice shelf in northern Greenland, far from any settlement. They were there for 2 weeks, collecting climate data from automated weather instruments and drilling core samples from the permafrost below. That night, the wind had finally died down after days of relentless howling. Snow drifted lightly over the ice, and the long twilight of the Arctic dawn still lighted the sky. Lars had gone to bed inside a small nylon tent just 50 meters from the central weather pod, zipped into a thermal-rated sleeping bag with his parka tucked beneath his head. Outside, the temperature hovered around -20°C, and the stillness was absolute. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the ears. The bear came from the north. It had likely smelled the camp from kilometers away, its nose catching a trace of food oil or human scent. Polar bears hunted with terrifying patience, and this one moved with ghost-like precision, crossing the frozen plain in silence. There were no fences, no barriers, just gear stowed in crates and nylon shelters pinned to the ice. The researchers hadn't seen tracks in days, but the bear had come anyway, padding softly through the wind-smoothed snow. Lars didn't wake when the bear first touched the tent. The weight came suddenly, a pressure explosion as the wall collapsed inwards. Claws ripped through the fabric, and the floor shifted beneath him. Then the sleeping bag moved. He was being dragged. At first, he thought it was a storm. Then he heard the crunching of paws and the low, rumbling breath. The bear had the sleeping bag in its jaws, shaking it as it pulled him across the ice. His body twisted inside the fabric, bouncing off frozen ridges. The cold tore through as the zipper burst open. Then he felt the pain. Teeth crushed into his upper arm, grinding bone. Another bite clamped onto his shoulder, tearing muscle. He screamed, but the sound vanished into the empty white around him. His mind spun in panic. The weight, the jaws, the ice beneath. It was happening so fast, yet each second burned with detail. In the nearby pod, a colleague, Dr. Sophie Roning, was finishing a weather reading when she heard the tent collapse. She glanced through the window and saw movement. Then she heard the scream. Without hesitation, she grabbed the emergency flare gun and rushed into the cold, boots crunching over the ice. The flare hissed upward in a brilliant arc, red fire lighting the air above the camp. The bear flinched. It dropped Lars and turned toward the light, confused and squinting. Lars, bleeding and limp, lay beside his shredded bag, barely conscious. Sophie ran to him, yelling and waving. The bear lingered just meters away, massive and pale, its breath steaming as it paced in irritation. She fired another flare. The bear turned, lumbered a few steps, and vanished into the fog like a ghost dissolving in smoke. Sophie dropped to her knees beside Lars. Blood soaked through the ice around his arm and shoulder, and his face was gray with shock. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. She wrapped his wounds with thermal wraps and radioed for medevac. Though she knew the truth, no chopper would reach them quickly. A storm was building offshore. They'd be lucky to see help before nightfall. She kept him stable for hours, monitoring his pulse and swapping heat packs while scanning the horizon. The other researchers huddled inside the pod with rifles ready. Nobody slept. When the storm eased 8 hours later, a Station Nord helicopter finally arrived. The evacuation was brutal. Wind tossed the aircraft, and medics had to load Lars with care to avoid aggravating the injuries. He was rushed to a trauma center, where doctors performed emergency surgery to save his arm. They managed to stop the bleeding and repair some of the torn muscle, but the nerve damage was permanent. Lars lost partial use of his left arm and would carry a slight limp from frostbite in his hip, where the bear had dragged him bare-skinned over the ice. The polar research community reeled. Photos of the shredded tent and blood-stained drag marks circulated among field teams. Safety protocols were rewritten overnight. Every Arctic station now enforced armed patrols, elevated sleeping pods, round-the-clock watch shifts, and new emergency beacon standards. For Lars, the healing was slow. The physical pain came in bursts, numb fingers, scar tissue tightening across the shoulder. But the worst damage was quiet. Sleep became hard. He would jolt awake, heart racing, feeling the crushing jaws again. Sometimes, the silence of his apartment brought back the same sensation he'd felt before the attack. That absolute stillness, just seconds before death arrived. He gave interviews months later. People expected anger, bitterness, maybe resentment toward the animal that had nearly killed him. But Lars only spoke of the moment before it all, the way the silence had held everything in place, how the bear hadn't growled, hadn't snarled, had just come like a force of nature. He didn't see it as malice, only hunger, instinct, and a clash between two lives that never should have touched. He said what haunted him most wasn't the pain, or the blood, or even the fear. It was how close death had come without a sound, and how easily, in the frozen heart of the Arctic, it could happen again.